Good morning. I'm Glenn Lowry, and welcome to this preview for Louise Lawler, Why Pictures Matter, with Roxana Markuch, curator of the exhibition. And before we begin, let me just acknowledge the many people and foundations that made this project possible. We're particularly grateful to the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, the Modern Women's Fund here at the Museum of Modern Art, the Walton Family Foundation, and we're also grateful to a committed group of generous individuals, David Deckman and Michel Mercure, Foten Demoulas and Tom Cote, Tracy and Gary Mezzatesta, Susan and Arthur Fleischer, Patrice and Louis Friedman, Mark Diker, and Anne and Mel Schaefer. And to all of those who made this exhibition a reality, just know how meaningful that is to us. So Roxana, Louise Lawler, why pictures matter? Why do they matter?
Well, Glenn, that's the main question of this exhibition. And the title itself comes from one of the earliest works by Louise, Why Pictures Now? It is a work from 1981, a small, very small picture, black and white, where you see a matchbook inscribed with these precise words in an ashtray. It's a very kind of cinematic work, kind of a noirish film still. And it's a direct address. It's a question, it's an affirmation, but it's an address to the viewer as to why do pictures matter? Why is Louise Lawler making pictures now? And why does this particular work takes the form of a picture? So, first of all, the emphasis in that title is on the now, meaning that the works in this exhibition and the exhibition itself exist in the present moment, that they are radically contemporary. At the same time, why pictures, the word pictures, kind of directly points to the fact that Louise Lawler came of age as part of the pictures generation, which was named after an influential exhibition that the scholar Douglas Crimp organized in 1977 at Artispace, which was called Pictures, and which in fact introduced a whole new generation of artists known as the Pictures generation. Now, this was a very loosely knit, highly independent group of artists who were, in fact, using still and moving images, as well as appropriation-driven strategies to kind of probe the functions of representation. Louise actually did not take part of that exhibition, yet she, more than any other artist from that group of artists, began using and incorporating the term pictures into the title of her works. And in fact, in the exhibition, you'll find, like, I always love that picture, or pictures that may or may not go together. The titles of her shows, Why Pictures Now, and the title of her film screenings. And in fact, we're going to have 2 film screenings here at the museum on May 2nd and May 10th of a historic cinematic experience by Louise, and that is a movie will be shown without the picture.
So the issue, though, that's interesting today is that we're in a digital world. So the whole notion of the image or the picture has changed so radically from when Louise began making so many of these works. So how does she locate herself in the kind of altered landscape of picture making today?
Well, first of all, I think that Louise this is her first survey exhibition in New York. And I think that in a certain way, this exhibition at once invites thesis and ultimately challenges retrospective impulse. And one of the most kind of characteristic and interesting aspects of her practice today is the way that she looks at works not in, or at the history of her own career, not in a linear way, but rather she thinks about the transitivity of art and what happens to pictures in a digital age. So one of the most intriguing aspects of this show is, in fact, the way that Louise has been reformatting, restaging, or reframing her photographs through various different formats. And you will see the relationship in the show between photographs that you have a one-to-one relationship to them, regular pictures on the wall, to the very tiny paperweights where you really have to lean over them one person at a time. They have a jewel-like quality or a peep-like show kind of feeling, to the very large billboard size adjusted to fit images, to the ghostly presence of the tracings. All of these are the same images that have been reformatted in different ways, and that speaks to our digital age, to the way that pictures are being proliferated, but also to the relationship that we have to images in the current age. And so Louise has been reappropriating her own work in order to precisely speak and to the way that we relate to images today.
Her interests, of course, are broad, but she has made looking at art a subject. Or so her photos, her pictures are often about pictures. So there's a kind of layered dimension to that. And I'm interested in why she turned to interrogating the way art is placed, located, seen as a subject.
Right. Well, in fact, when you go to the 6th floor, you have a whole history of art, definitely a whole history of 20th century art in these photographs. There are many relationships to be investigated. If you think about it, a lot of two of the artists that she's been photographing quite often are Warhol and Richter, and these artists' own relationship between their paintings and the methods of their reproduction, whether silk screens or based on photographs in the case of Richter, that's in itself is very interesting, this relationship about how one medium interprets another. But I think that one of the kind of important moments for Louise came early on when she was given access to an important art collection, the Tremaines collection, where she had access to photograph it. And one of the early works there is, for instance, Monogram, which is a work that was shot in the bedroom of the Tremaines, and you see the Jasper Johns, white flag, and the hanging above their bed with a bed sheet with a monogram on it, which is also white. And that kind of relationship, well, if you think of Johns, and Johns being very much within the tradition of Cage and Duchamp, people who are resisting notions of taste. And then you look at the monogram on a bedsheet, which is all about class and taste. You can see how one inflects the other, and how in turn perhaps the John's painting, and especially his alphabets, make you think differently about the monogram on the bedsheet itself. So how one thing works with the other, this kind of formal relationship, how collectors sometimes place their works, or how museums display the works before or after an installation of the show, how auction houses place works of other, of artists in order to enter the market. All of these aspects that we fail to notice when we look at an artwork, because we tend to focus just on the work itself, the context in which it's being presented constitutes also for Louise and for us the meaning of the work. The whole history of reception, on how viewers relate to one work, that's also part of the meaning of the work. So she takes into consideration a larger context.
And should we read these as subversive? Are they critiques, or are they dispassionate observations?
Well, in fact, we were earlier in the galleries with a number of people from the press, and each one had a different, and that's the beauty of it. Reception is all about how a particular person reacts to a certain work. And some felt that they were very sociological, and in fact, her work has been called a sociological comment turned image. Others were really drawn to the beauty and the seductiveness of the photograph. So it really is in the eye of the beholder, more or less. There is one work in the exhibition, in fact, two works in the exhibition that show the same image. It's the identical image. It's an image taken at an auction of Andy Warhol's Round Marilyn. They hang across from each other, and it's identical in every single aspect of the word, except for the title. One title is Does Andy Warhol Make You Cry? And the other one is Does Marilyn Monroe Make You Cry? So once again, by addressing the viewer and asking you to, how do you feel versus this one image, when you think of Andy Warhol versus when you think of, Marilyn Monroe, a very iconic but dead actress, versus the author of a work, a very well-known pop artist, that changes the meaning of the work. So you will have very different reactions to Louise's practice. And in fact, we decided that we will give a different title to our book than to the exhibition. The book is called Receptions. It includes 8 different essays, and it's all about the reception of the work and how it changes in function of the reading of various, authors or readers or viewers.
You talked a little bit about film. Let's talk about sound, because that's another area that Louise has explored and actually offers a very different, I think, in fact, humorous side to a practice that otherwise can seem very serious.
Well, in a way, the film and the sound work that is playing in the Abby Aldrich Rockefeller Sculpture Garden, which is titled Bird Calls, are related because they are both about sound experiences. The film is a movie will be shown without the picture. It's an altered cinematic experience because you are sitting in a theater watching a blank screen, but very much responding to the sound. And the Bird Calls points to another aspect of Louise's work, and that is her very witty, sly, feminist, provocations. This work was actually started in the 70s when the independent curator and publisher Willoughby Sharp organized an exhibition that was called Pier 18 from the location where it was taking place, and where he invited 27 all-male artists to participate in it. Louise was friends with many of them, and she was assisting some of them. And one late night, as she was coming back home on the deserted downtown area, she decided to sing Willoughby, which was the name of the curator, in order to ward off unwanted interaction. And a year later, that resulted into Bird Calls, in which she chirps and squawks and twitters the name of very famous male artists, from Vito Acconci to Lawrence Weiner. So you have Cruchet, John, from John Baldessari. And that's playing in the garden, and of course that was her, response to this patronymic proper name for which male artists were very well known, but not women artists.
And despite the weather, I urge you either to venture out there, which you probably can't do because the garden gets closed when it gets too wet, but to return and discover this piece, because it always makes me just smile, because it's got all of those sly dimensions built into it, and you always get startled, right? Because you're not quite sure what she's saying and what's actually happening. I want to turn back to some of the more recent work, especially the scale to fit work, which is not just, where she's not just scaling to a new size, she's also willfully distorting, so that there's something else going on here in the image that It's almost, I don't want to call it a destruction of the image, but it is definitely a deconstruction that's taking place.
No, you're absolutely right, Glenn. I mean, I think with the adjusted to fit, you're going to have distortion in them because they are being pulled to the dimension of the wall where you're going to display them. So there is a certain level of anamorphosis in them. There is one work which Louise took, one of the adjusted to fit, and she twisted further, and that happened in January of this year. It's a very recent work. It's for the very first time presented this type of work here in this exhibition. And the picture itself is called Pollyanna, because it is adjusted to fit. It's Pollyanna adjusted to fit. But because it is further distorted, the title is Pollyanna adjusted to fit, distorted for the times. And that work was done in response to the whole alternative facts, discourse that kind of captured our nation in January, and to the post-truth era. And Louise had this instant reaction of further twisting it and twirling the image to distort, because that's how the reality in which we live now is. And a lot of her work is feminist, but a lot of her work is also political, is anti-war, and there are many works in the exhibition that point to those aspects, such as No Drones, War is Terror, Grieving Mothers, Civilian, that were done in response to very specific political events in the history of the last, very recent, or of the last 10 years or so.
So with that, let's turn it over to you to see if there are any questions you have for Roxana. Yes, please.
Thank you. This question is especially for Glenn, and I think it's obvious that her work has a critical, humorous, satirical component that is critiquing our institutions, critiquing the art world in particular, how we look at art, how we sell art, how we value art, all of those things. And it's sometimes very true and very funny and powerful. But my question is, how much of this could simply be in an article? Do we need this kind of real estate space devoted? And this applies to other shows that MoMA has done recently too, that seem to take a lot of space to make very witty, essentially verbal points and political points that are very true, but it's a lot of space devoted to it.
Well, I'll let Roxana answer part of that question, but certainly from my point of view, Louise's work isn't only about an institutional critique or even an institutional investigation or an assertion of a set of feminist values. I think it's also highly visual. In other words, I find her ability to navigate between the almost microscopic and the monumental visually exciting. And I think that for me, the revelation about Louise was that here's an artist who looks very carefully, whose images are extraordinarily concise. They are really beautifully constructed, and often, for me, appreciated at a kind of conventional scale, even if that scale is, larger than an 8x10, but still very much a conventional scale. And they're very satisfying, because when you look at her work, you inevitably discover something even about your own institution you weren't aware of. How a label is not perfectly aligned, how our fetish for lighting can, in effect, distort the way a work is actually seen, or just how a beautifully, how casual a work of art can be laid on the ground as if it were a pillow, and then suddenly become something priceless when its location is altered and it's hung on the wall. All these things she makes us acutely aware of that I think are fascinating. But what I discovered in the show was how powerful her work is when she scales it differently. And and I mean it going in both directions. Her ability to condense and concentrate our looking by going to the almost microscopic, and her ability to exhilarate us by suddenly taking something we thought we understood and making it utterly unfamiliar. So if it takes a certain amount of real estate to explore both her work in all of its visual dimensions as well as all of its intellectual dimensions, I'm grateful that we have the space to do that. And I think one of our goals, one of our commitments, is to try and be the kind of institution that can be generous with artists, to give them the space they need to work at the scale they want, whether it's as large as Louise or as small as somebody else might choose. So I don't think this is only about some kind of political statement on her part. That's a rambling answer to a good question. I don't know how you feel.
Well, it's interesting because I just got another question previously from another very well-known critic who asked, couldn't it have been a little bigger? And so, again, that's a very personal feeling that you have, and I appreciate the comment. On the other hand, I would say, I think we are used for women to have always smaller shows. I think we should give them the right space, and especially an artist like Louise Lawler, who is one of the most modest people that I have known who have resisted survey exhibition. This, as I mentioned, is her first one in the United States. There are many aspects of her work that are unknown, many aspects that need a lot more of insightful readings, and once you start really looking hard enough, you get to the intricacies of both the beauty of her visual presentation, but also the conceptual underpinnings of her work. And one of the most interesting also aspects to me is that this exhibition is very generous towards other artists. Louise has been a collaborator with many other artists, and you're going to find in it works by other people such as Alan McCollum and Felix Gonzalez Torres, who is one of his paper stacks, but it bears an image of Louise. It's another political work. It's a missile that's gone out of control, but that it's titled "Beautiful" by Louise, and that's the image on it. The whole ephemera has never been shown here, and that speaks of a whole history of a whole generation of artists from the 70s to today. And even Burkholz is a work that comes from the collection of Solowit, because Solowit so much loved the work that he wanted to have an artistic exchange between works with Louise. So Louise got a wall drawing, and Solowit got Burkholz. So I think that it's more than meets the eye. There will be more discoveries along the way when you'll have a chance to go back to the show, I hope, more than once.
Other questions? Yes?
I arrived a little late, so if I missed it, you can just skip it. But could you talk maybe a little about the big cartoonish tracings or the drawings, and also the works behind you, the falling cherry blossom pieces?
So the adjusted to fit and the tracings, those larger works that are in direct dialogue with the photographs and with the ephemera. This is a piece of ephemera. Again, they speak about the transitivity of her work, of how her work is kind of goes into various cycles of mediation and reformatting. The tracings are basically very ghostly black and white outlines of her photographs. They provide a very different feeling from the colored pictures or from the, adjusted to fit works. They are done in collaboration with the artist and illustrator John Buller, and they look like coloring books. And I think that there is a relationship with Andy Warhol and the paint by numbers works of Warhol. Warhol was, you know, one of the artists who were so much interested in this type of silk screening techniques. And Louise had a long time relationship that is acknowledged in the exhibition. As you enter immediately, there are some of her works from her very first exhibition here in New York at Metro Pictures in 1982, which was called Arrangement of Pictures, which shows the Warhol poster along with works by other artists. And the story is, in fact, of that poster that Louise met Andy at a party at Frank Stella's home that in the 70s. That was done as a surprise party for the 20th anniversary of Leo Castelli's gallery. And Warhol was always wearing with him a camera, but he was in need of a roll of film, and Louise had an extra one and gave it to him. So 2 weeks later, Warhol sent her a poster, the cow poster, which is also here at MoMA, with a note that you can even read it, to Louise, love, Andy Warhol, 1977. So this kind of relationship between the mechanical reproduction of the work that Warhol was interested, Rauschenberg was interested in it, appears also in Louise's work in the tracings. It's just that it's such a radical transformation from the photograph to something that looks more like a drawing or like a coloring book, as I said. And this appears on an iPad as a moving image. It's cherry blossom season, and it's an intervention on one of her photographs. That's all it is.
Are there other questions? If not, I want to take a moment to salute Roxanne on an absolutely ravishingly beautiful exhibition that brings pleasure and joy, but also a great deal of surprise as we get to know Louise Lawler even better. So thank you, Roxanne.
Thank you, Glenn.